Few men have the stomach to survive in the violent shadows of organized crime. Fewer still can rise to power and hold their place atop a mountain of corpses. Today, we explore 5 of the most brutal mobsters in history, men who didn't just embrace violence, they thrived on it. First, meet Abner Longie Zwillman, a towering figure in more ways than one. A master of the double cross and a dealer of death, Zwillman clawed his way from Newark's slums to build an empire steeped in blood, fear and betrayal. But in the world of crime, kings often fall the hardest, and Zwillman's end was as chilling as his reign. Abner Longie Zwillman's rise in the criminal underworld began not in shadows, but under the harsh glare of Newark's impoverished streets. The son of Russian Jewish immigrants, Longie had his first taste of hardship while navigating his youth amidst the broken cobblestones of Hillside Place. He was tall for his age, towering over his peers, and his imposing stature earned him the moniker Longie. Yet it wasn't his height that distinguished him. It was his cunning, a serpentine brilliance that would lead him from petty street gangs to the zenith of New Jersey's criminal empire. The 1920s roared with opportunity, and Prohibition's shadow cast a long and lucrative net. Longie, who had abandoned school by 8th grade, wasted no time aligning himself with the burgeoning underworld. A gangly teen with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes, he turned to the only lucrative trade available to someone of his station, crime. The streets of Newark's 3rd Ward were dominated by makeshift rackets and primitive protection schemes. Longie's sharp mind quickly turned these disorganized ventures into a structured network. His first taste of real power came through rum running. He commandeered a fleet of trucks, their hulking frames loaded with illegal alcohol, and deftly maneuvered through a labyrinth of bribes and ambushes. On one occasion, a rival gang's attempt to intercept his shipment escalated into a roadside bloodbath. Longie's men emerged victorious, and as the corpses were dragged into ditches under the cover of night, his reputation solidified. The young gangster had arrived, a lion among wolves, and Newark's underbelly took notice. Power, however, attracts enemies. In 1927, Longie was arrested for assault, his first brush with the law. Though the charges were dismissed, his next arrest, another assault case, landed him a 6-month sentence in the Essex County Penitentiary. For most, prison would mark a nada, but Longie's incarceration was an opportunity. Inside the penitentiary, his influence extended beyond the barred windows. Guards treated him as a guest of honor. He dined on meals smuggled in from Newark's finest delis and managed his rackets via a telephone installed in his cell. When his sentence ended, he gifted the warden a new car, a quiet declaration that even steel bars could not contain him. Freed and emboldened, Longie expanded his empire. He forged alliances with the East Coast's most notorious figures, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano. These men were not mere criminals, they were architects of organized crime. Longie, ever the opportunist, ingratiated himself with these titans, lending money to bootlegging syndicates and investing in gambling operations. His charm, a blend of streetwise grit and polished sophistication, made him a favorite among the underworld elite. In 1932, Longie's influence reached its apex during the infamous Lindbergh baby kidnapping. With New Jersey under intense scrutiny, Longie's alcohol trucks faced the risk of random searches. To protect his interests, he offered a substantial reward for information on the kidnapping. While the gesture painted him as a benefactor, it was a calculated move to deflect attention from his operations. The move worked, solidifying his reputation as both a criminal mastermind and a man of peculiar honor. But Longie's ascent was not without friction. Rivalries simmered, particularly with Richie the Boot Boyardo, the First Ward's de facto boss. Tensions escalated to a boiling point when armed intruders raided Longie's 3rd Ward political club. The act was a blatant declaration of war, forcing a peace conference mediated by Mafia leaders. Though the conflict subsided, it revealed cracks in Longie's armor. His empire was vast but precarious, a house of cards trembling under its own weight. By the late 1930s, federal scrutiny intensified. Longie's refusal to testify before a grand jury investigating the disappearance of Lepka Buchalter earned him a contempt charge, though it was later overturned. The public saw him as untouchable, but the government saw a target. Investigators dissected his finances, uncovering discrepancies between his lavish lifestyle and reported income. The walls were closing in. Despite mounting pressure, Longie's audacity knew no bounds. In 1939, he married Mary Mendel Steinbach in a wedding so opulent it attracted hundreds of racketeers from across the nation. The union was not just personal, but political, cementing alliances that fortified his position. The couple settled in a sprawling mansion in West Orange, a fortress of luxury that became both a sanctuary and a gilded cage. Longie diversified his ventures, investing in legitimate businesses while maintaining a grip on illegal operations. He partnered with Luciano in controlling jukebox and vending machine rackets, turning mundane devices into profit generators. His influence extended to Las Vegas, Hollywood, and beyond. He was no longer just New Jersey's kingpin, he was a national figure. Yet, the veneer of invincibility could not withstand the relentless march of justice. By the 1950s, the Kefauver Committee's investigation into organized crime brought Longie under the harshest scrutiny yet. Subpoenaed to testify, he faced a barrage of questions about his associates and operations. Longie, ever the fox, evaded direct answers, but the public spectacle tarnished his reputation. Behind closed doors, the pressure intensified. In 1959, with federal indictments looming, Longie's empire began to fracture. On February 27, 1959, he was found hanging in his mansion's basement. Authorities ruled it a suicide. But whispers of foul play echoed through the underworld. Some believed he had been silenced by former allies fearing exposure. Others speculated that the weight of his empire's collapse drove him to despair. Abner Longie Zwillman's life was a symphony of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy. He rose from the gutters of Newark to the pinnacle of organized crime, wielding power with a mix of generosity and ruthlessness. Yet in the end, the empire he built consumed him. His story is a stark reminder that in the world of crime, even kings can collapse under the weight of the crown. Paolo Paul Palmieri was more than a mafia foot soldier. He was a craftsman of chaos and carnage. From the shadowy streets of Castellammare del Golfo to the blood-soaked backrooms of the American underworld, Palmieri orchestrated a reign of terror that spanned decades. Bootlegging empires rose and fell under his watch, their failures marked by dismembered bodies dumped in alleys or stuffed into trunks. His name was whispered in connection to some of the era's most horrifying spectacles: kidnappings with no ransom, car bombings that painted streets red, and murders so savage they redefined mafia vengeance. With ties to crime legends like Al Capone's outfit and Stefano Magaddino, Palmieri lived by one rule: no one escapes the cost of betrayal, and the price is always paid in blood. Paolo Palmieri was born on October 1, 1892, in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, to Francesco and Anna Caleca Palmieri. Raised in an upper-middle-class family supported by his father's work as a merchant, Paul and his two brothers, Giovanni and Benedetto, aka Angelo, experienced relative privilege compared to others in their town. At the age of 16, Paul boarded the SS Princess Irene and arrived in New York City on February 27, 1909. Settling in Manhattan's Italian district, he found employment as a barber. In 1914, he married Elena Helen Curti, and the couple began a family. They eventually relocated to Niagara Falls in 1920, where Paul joined his brother Angelo in establishing a network of bootlegging operations. This enterprise thrived during Prohibition, involving key figures like the Siriani brothers, Don Simone Baruso, Joseph H. Sotile, and Canadian crime boss Rocco Perry. Together, they orchestrated the smuggling of illegal liquor from Canada into the United States. In addition to bootlegging, Paul and Angelo Palmieri entered legitimate business ventures, including produce importation. By 1928, Paul had diversified further, partnering with Alfred Panepinto to establish the Panepinto and Palmieri Funeral Home. However, these legal fronts belied their deeper criminal associations. Paul was a trusted ally within the Western New York Mafia, led by Stefano Magaddino. When the Castellammarese War erupted between Mafia factions, Paul aligned with Salvatore Maranzano, who represented the Castellammarese interests. Maranzano's murder in September 1931 would later reveal Palmieri's proximity to significant events. Police found his contact information in Maranzano's memo book. Paul's notoriety grew with his involvement in a 1931 kidnapping case in Chicago. He and 4 others, including associates of Al Capone's Chicago outfit, were arrested for allegedly abducting fur dealer Alexander Berg. Though charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, the incident underscored Palmieri's connections across multiple mafia organizations. Subsequent arrests highlighted Paul's continued criminal entanglements. In 1932, he was apprehended during an investigation into the brutal murder of Pittsburgh Mafia boss John Bazzano. Bazzano had ordered the execution of 3 Neapolitan brothers, prompting retaliation from Mafia leaders. Bazzano's corpse, found bound and stabbed with ice picks, bore testimony to the severe penalties for overstepping boundaries within the organization. Although Paul was not convicted, the incident tied him to a network of powerful, dangerous individuals. In 1934, Paul's criminal activities led to his first prison sentence, 30 days for assaulting a police officer at a traffic accident scene. Meanwhile, tensions within the Magaddino crime family escalated, particularly as Stefano Magaddino imposed tribute demands on local bookmakers. This conflict culminated in 1936 with the bombing death of Magaddino's sister, Arcangela Longo. Paul, delivering her eulogy, publicly affirmed his loyalty to the Magaddino family while privately navigating the violent undercurrents. The fallout was swift and bloody. Frank Latempio, a defiant bookmaker, was murdered, while his brother Russell narrowly survived a car bomb. Paul's partnership with Panepinto dissolved, likely influenced by Panepinto's familial ties to the Latempios. Panepinto relocated to Batavia, only to be murdered in 1937. By 1940, Paul's professional focus shifted. He partnered with Antonino Magaddino in the funeral home business, which later became the Magaddino Funeral Home. However, a rift with Stefano Magaddino in 1941 prompted Paul's relocation to Passaic, New Jersey, where he reconnected with Willie Moretti of the Genovese crime family. Paul's criminal career continued unabated. In 1942, he faced federal charges for leading a bootlegging ring that evaded $3.5 million in taxes. Convicted, he served 3 years in prison and paid a $9,000 fine. Upon his release, his son Frank's marriage to Moretti's daughter Marie further solidified ties between the Palmieri and Moretti families. When Moretti was assassinated in 1951, Paul's closeness to the victim made him a material witness in the investigation. Paul Palmieri's life of crime came to an end on May 7, 1955, when he died at Passaic General Hospital after a brief illness. His wife, Helen, outlived him, passing away in 1998 at the age of 101. Palmieri's legacy remains intertwined with the violent and intricate history of organized crime in America.
Nicky Santora didn't deal in second chances. His world was painted in 2 colors, loyalty and blood. Those who stayed true were spared. Those who faltered became examples, grotesque and unforgettable. Known as Nicky Cigars, he was the artist of agony, turning warehouses and alleyways into canvases of despair. Cross him, and your screams would echo long after your body was found, if it was found at all. Today, we delve into the legend of a man who didn't just enforce the rules of the Mafia, he rewrote them in ways too horrifying to forget. The night Nicky Santora earned his infamy was one New York would not soon forget. It began innocuously enough, a drizzle dampening the streets, the city's neon glow fractured by countless raindrops. But in the shadowed alleyways of Brooklyn, where Santora's power simmered, something far more dangerous than rain was brewing. Santora, known in whispered circles as Nicky Cigars, moved like a shadow through the city. His tailored suit clung to his stocky frame, a testament to vanity even in the underworld. Yet, beneath the veneer of respectability, he was a monster in a man's skin. That night, he was poised to settle a score, a debt of blood owed by betrayal. The clang of an iron gate echoed as he entered a crumbling warehouse near the docks, a perfect theater for the night's grim symphony. Inside, the air was fetid with the mingled stench of mildew and decay. Nicky's lieutenants had already secured the guest of honor, a trembling man named Carmine Torelli, bound to a wooden chair beneath a single flickering bulb. Carmine's face, swollen and streaked with blood, betrayed the hours of persuasion he had endured. But his silence was not loyalty. It was fear, a terror so consuming that even the promise of death could not loosen his tongue. Nicky approached with deliberate steps, each one reverberating like a death knell. His fingers trailed over a workbench littered with tools, pliers, a blowtorch, and something far more grotesque, a meat hook crusted with old rust. He chose the hook, its cold metal gleaming ominously in the dim light. Without a word, he crouched to meet Carmine's bloodshot gaze, his expression a chilling mask of calm. "You thought you could cross me?" Nicky's voice was a low, menacing growl. Then, without waiting for an answer, he drove the hook into Carmine's shoulder, a sickening crunch of bone and sinew filling the silence. The scream that followed was inhuman, a guttural wail that seemed to rattle the very walls. Nicky stood, satisfied, and yanked the hook free. Blood sprayed in an arc, pooling on the concrete floor like spilled wine. But the evening's entertainment was far from over. Nicky's second-in-command, a wiry man with eyes as cold as winter's edge, dragged in another captive, a young woman, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was Carmine's sister, a desperate pawn in this macabre game. Her arrival brought a cruel smile to Nicky's lips. He didn't need words. Her presence was the ultimatum. Betrayal would not only cost Carmine his life, but destroy his family too. As Carmine broke, spilling secrets between sobs and screams, Nicky's men took notes, their faces impassive. This was not an act of vengeance. It was a demonstration, a lesson carved into flesh and fear. When Carmine had given all he could, Nicky ended his misery with a single gunshot to the head, the sound muffled by the thick walls but still deafening in its finality. The young woman was spared, not out of mercy, but as a witness, her mind forever scarred by what she had seen. She would spread the tale, ensuring the legend of Nicky Cigars grew ever darker. The next morning, the warehouse was empty, save for the bloody chair and Carmine's lifeless body, left as a grotesque warning. The police arrived hours later, summoned by an anonymous tip, but the scene told them nothing they hadn't seen before. In this part of town, the Mafia's whispers were louder than any siren. Weeks later, Santora strolled into a dimly lit bar, his presence commanding every pair of eyes. Conversations halted mid-sentence as he lit a cigar with a steady hand, the flicker of the flame casting fleeting shadows across his face. To the outside world, he was just another player in the city's seedy underbelly. But to those who knew him, Nicky Cigars was something far more sinister, a predator cloaked in civility, a man whose power rested on the broken bodies of those who dared defy him. Santora's rise within the Bonanno family was not a meteoric ascension, but a calculated climb, each step paved with blood and betrayal. In 1981, the discovery of FBI agent Joe Pistone's infiltration, posing as Donnie Brasco, threatened to unravel the entire criminal network. The fallout was swift and brutal. Nicky, alongside Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano and Benjamin Lefty Guns Ruggiero, found themselves in the crosshairs of suspicion and retribution. It was Sonny Black who bore the brunt of the Mafia's wrath. Days after refusing the FBI's offer of protection, his mutilated body was discovered near a Staten Island creek, his hands severed as a symbol of his failure. Nicky's involvement in orchestrating the hit was an open secret, though never proven. He thrived in the chaos, his cunning and ruthlessness ensuring his survival where others fell. Years later, during his racketeering trial, Nicky sat impassive as FBI agent Pistone described the murders with chilling precision. "You should have seen when they shot him," Pistone recalled Nicky boasting. 50 pounds of his stomach went flying. The courtroom recoiled, but Nicky remained unmoved, his expression unreadable. Even as the guilty verdicts piled up, his legend only grew. In the end, Santora's reign was brought down not by bullets or betrayal, but by the relentless grind of justice. Sentenced to 15 years in prison, he left the courtroom with the same calm arrogance that had defined his life. Yet even behind bars, his name carried weight, a grim reminder that some shadows never truly fade.
When you're born into the shadowy embrace of a mafia dynasty, destiny doesn't ask, it demands. Santo Trafficante Jr., heir to the Tampa underworld, didn't just inherit his father's empire, he expanded it into an international juggernaut of power, fear, and violence. From the humid streets of Ybor City to the glittering casinos of Havana, Trafficante's reign was a chess game played with bloodied pieces. But in the world of organized crime, even kings can be toppled. Let's dive into the life of the man whose name became synonymous with the dark side of the American dream, unraveling his meteoric rise, shadowy dealings, and the conspiracies that continue to haunt his legacy. Santo Trafficante Jr. was born into a dynasty of shadows on a sweltering November morning in 1914, the son of a mafia patriarch in the sultry streets of Tampa, Florida. Even as a child, the humid air of Ybor City, thick with the aroma of cigars and spilled blood, seemed to seep into his veins. His father, Santos Sr., ruled the Tampa underworld with an iron grip, running gambling rackets and extortion schemes with a ruthlessness that inspired fear and loyalty in equal measure. For young Santo, the family trade was not just a legacy, but a birthright, a dark crown, waiting for the perfect moment to fall on his head. In the cramped back room of a bolita parlor in Tampa, Santo Jr.'s initiation into the underworld came with the subtle clink of a revolver on a scarred wooden table. It was 1933, and a rival bookie had dared to encroach on Traficante territory. Santo Sr.'s voice, calm but weighted with menace, sliced through the smoke-filled air. "Handle it," he said, his gaze locking with his son's. Santo Jr.'s hands trembled as he accepted the gun, but his eyes betrayed none of the fear roiling inside him. That night, beneath the neon flicker of a cheap motel sign, Santo Jr. carried out his father's orders. The rival's screams were drowned out by the roar of passing trains as Santo's blade carved a permanent lesson into the man's flesh before leaving him to bleed out on the sticky asphalt. When Santo Jr. returned home, his shirt splattered with crimson, Santo Sr. clasped his shoulder, muttering, "You're ready." It was not praise, but a sentence. Santo Jr. had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. By the time Santo Sr. passed away in 1954, the Tampa underworld was seething with discontent. A faction loyal to the Italiano family refused to accept Santo Jr.'s ascension. On a humid spring night, Santo Jr. sat in his car outside a diner, his arm aching where shotgun pellets had torn through flesh weeks earlier in an assassination attempt. A mole within his ranks had tipped off the Italiano faction to his whereabouts. The betrayal stung more than the physical wounds. Determined to send a message, Santo Jr. turned to his powerful New York allies, whose influence could snuff out rebellions like a cigarette ground underfoot. Within days, Antonio Italiano and Dominic Ferrara vanished, swallowed by the void that claimed those who dared to defy the Traficante name. Rumors swirled of their bodies dissolved in acid, their screams echoing only in the nightmares of those left behind. The message was clear. Loyalty to Santo Jr. was not optional. In the late 1950s, Santo Jr.'s empire expanded beyond Tampa's borders, stretching its tentacles into Havana, Cuba. Under the corrupt Batista regime, Santo's investments in casinos like the Sans Souci and Hotel Deauville brought in rivers of cash. Havana became his personal playground, where the clink of roulette wheels masked the darker dealings in back rooms. Drug smuggling routes carved across the Caribbean, and blood-soaked agreements sealed with handshakes over expensive cigars. Santo Jr. was untouchable, or so it seemed, but the rise of Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces threatened to topple his carefully built empire. Santo Jr.'s attempt to negotiate with the new regime ended with his imprisonment in the squalid Triscornia detention camp. He paced the dank cell, his sharp mind calculating every possible escape. Weeks stretched into months before his release, but the message was clear. The Cuban underworld was no longer his domain. Returning to Tampa in 1960, he carried the sting of failure like a festering wound. The 1960s brought new dangers. Santo's connections to the CIA, an uneasy alliance forged in mutual hatred of Castro, plunged him into murky waters. Meetings in dimly lit rooms hatched plots to assassinate Castro, schemes that always unraveled before they could reach fruition. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, whispers began to swirl. Had Santo Traficante played a role? The conspiracies tied him to shadowy figures like Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli, both of whom met brutal ends before they could reveal too much. Santo's name became a ghost, haunting Senate hearings and investigative reports. Despite his denials, a chilling statement he'd once made lingered. Kennedy's not going to be around much longer. Whether boast or prophecy, it cast a dark shadow over his already tarnished reputation. Santo's empire began to crack under the weight of suspicion and relentless government scrutiny. Despite the mounting pressure, Santo Jr. proved as slippery as the eels sold in Tampa's markets. In 1986, federal prosecutors brought racketeering charges against him. Santo, his face a mask of calm, strolled into the courtroom with the air of a man who had seen hell and found it wanting. Witnesses disappeared, evidence mysteriously evaporated, and the case crumbled. The aging boss walked free, his reputation as untouchable cemented. Yet the victory was hollow. Santo's health was failing, his empire a shadow of its former glory. He retreated to the shadows where he had always felt most at home, watching as the underworld he had once commanded slipped through his fingers. On a rainy March night in 1987, Santo Traficante Jr. took his final breath in a sterile Houston hospital room, far from the blood-stained streets of Tampa and the glittering casinos of Havana. The official cause was heart failure, but whispers suggested otherwise. Some claimed the Mafia had silenced him to prevent him from speaking out. Others believed the weight of his sins had finally crushed him. As the rain lashed against the hospital windows, one thing was certain. Santo Traficante Jr.'s life had been a symphony of power and betrayal, rising crescendos of violence followed by plunging descents into chaos. His legacy, like the man himself, was shrouded in darkness, a testament to the brutal cost of ruling an empire built on blood. Frankie Yale emerged from Brooklyn's underworld as a figure of calculated ambition and violent resolve. Born Francesco Ioele on January 22, 1893, in Longobucco, Calabria, Yale emigrated to the United States with his family in 1907. But his rise to power came swiftly. By 1917, Yale was running his operations out of a Brooklyn speakeasy, his reputation for violence both a shield and a sword. Behind the polished front of his funeral home, Yale's services extended to disposing of rival corpses, earning him the moniker The Undertaker. The mortuary doubled as a chilling symbol of his influence, a place where life and death merged under his control. In 1920, Yale was allegedly dispatched to Chicago to eliminate mob boss Big Jim Colosimo, who had resisted aligning his operations with Prohibition-era bootlegging profits. According to whispered accounts, Yale entered Colosimo's cafe under the guise of friendship. Minutes later, Colosimo lay slumped over a blood-soaked table, a single gunshot to the head tearing through his skull and scattering fragments of bone and brain across the room. Though the murder was never conclusively tied to Yale, it cemented his reputation as an enforcer, willing to kill with efficiency and theatrical precision. Back in Brooklyn, Yale expanded his empire, operating nightclubs and smuggling liquor during Prohibition. His influence stretched across boroughs, and his connections with Al Capone in Chicago ensured a steady flow of money and power. Yet his business dealings were underscored by brutality. Yale was not content to simply eliminate rivals. He sent messages. His victims often bore the marks of torture or mutilation, their bodies left in public places as grim warnings. Yale's life was a cycle of bloodshed and revenge. In 1921, he orchestrated the brutal murder of Ernesto Melchiorre, a minor rival whose ambitions threatened Yale's grip on Brooklyn. Melchiorre's decapitated body was discovered in a shallow ditch near Coney Island, his headless corpse arranged deliberately to maximize horror. The scene was gruesome. Precise cuts suggested surgical expertise, but the viciousness of the act spoke of personal animosity. The killing ignited a feud with Melchiorre's brother, Silvio, who retaliated weeks later. On a sweltering July night, Yale's car was ambushed in a barrage of gunfire. Bullets tore through the vehicle, shattering glass and ripping through the upholstery. Yale, though wounded, managed to escape, dragging his brother Angelo, who was bleeding profusely, into the safety of a nearby alley. Days later, Silvio's body was found slumped in a tenement stairwell, his chest riddled with bullets and his hands crushed, a sign of the violent efficiency that Yale brought to his reprisals. As the 1920s wore on, Yale's alliances frayed, particularly with his one-time protégé, Al Capone. By 1928, Capone's growing empire in Chicago could no longer tolerate Yale's independent operations, especially after rumors circulated that Yale had intercepted a shipment of whiskey meant for Capone and sold it for his gain. The betrayal sealed his fate. On July 1, 1928, as Yale drove his gleaming Lincoln coupe through Brooklyn, a black sedan roared up beside him. Inside, assassins armed with a Thompson submachine gun and a sawed-off shotgun opened fire. The air erupted with the staccato rattle of gunfire. Bullets pierced the car's chassis, shattering windows and riddling Yale's body with fatal wounds. His skull was split open by a shotgun blast, fragments of bone and flesh spattering the dashboard. The car careened into a building, its horn blaring as Yale slumped lifeless against the wheel, blood pooling beneath him in dark rivulets that flowed into the street. The scene of Yale's murder was a spectacle of violence, the broken glass and blood-streaked metal drawing gawkers from blocks away. His death marked the first recorded use of a Thompson submachine gun in a gangland killing, a weapon that would soon become synonymous with Prohibition-era violence. Yale's funeral was equally ostentatious. Thousands gathered to witness the procession, his casket draped in flowers and carried by pallbearers in immaculate suits. But behind the veneer of mourning, his empire fractured almost immediately. Rival gangs carved up his territories, and his allies, including Capone, moved on with calculated indifference. Frankie Yale's life embodied the transient nature of power in the underworld. His rise was fueled by ambition and violence, his downfall by betrayal and greed. In death, as in life, Yale remained a figure of fear, a reminder that even the most ruthless are not immune to the Reaper's call.